The party was a masterpiece of deception. Gold and black balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and a banner proclaiming Happy 60th hung over the fireplace. My mother, the architect of this whole surprise, moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, but all I could see was the lie behind her smile. My gaze kept drifting back to my father. He was the guest of honor, yet he seemed to be watching a play from a great distance. He was smiling, yes, but his eyes were perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Then I heard it. The sharp ting of a spoon against a champagne flute. My mother stood, her face glowing with a secret triumph. She had no idea she was walking into a reckoning. Before I tell you how that single, quiet smile brought my mother's entire world crashing down, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the fallout from that night. There's a particular kind of helplessness in watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, knowing that in a few moments, nothing will ever be the same again. Have you ever been in that position? Forced to be a silent witness to a coming wreck? Let us know in the comments below. To truly grasp the weight of that moment, you first have to understand the picture-perfect life my mother was about to shatter. The story of that night really began months earlier, in a house that was a monument to their marriage. To the outside world, my parents were the blueprint for success, a 35-year legacy that seemed unbreakable. My father was a quiet, hard-working man who measured his life in projects completed and promises kept. My mother was the opposite. Bright, ambitious, the brilliant sun around which our family was supposed to orbit. And then there was Mark, my father's best friend since college. Uncle Mark. He wasn't just a friend, he was part of the architecture of our lives. Present at every holiday, every birthday. Our home always felt like a magazine spread, with polished floors and the faint scent of my mother's expensive candles. But for the last year, a new kind of silence had settled in. It was a cold, watchful quiet that clung to the air after my mother left for one of her new book club meetings. The perfection of the house began to feel brittle, like a thin layer of ice over deep, dark water. It was a silence my father seemed to understand completely. He wasn't a loud man, but the things he did say carried immense weight. I remember him saying something once that I carried for years without ever truly understanding its weight. We were at some charity dinner my mother had insisted we attend, a room filled with loud conversations and even louder declarations of success. He leaned over to me, his voice barely a whisper against the noise, and said, "The loudest person in the room is usually the weakest. True strength is quiet." At the time, I just nodded, thinking it was a simple observation. But looking back, I realized it was the code he lived by, the principle behind every calm decision. It was a language he taught me, not with grand speeches, but in the quiet moments we shared, the ones my mother never saw. It was the shared understanding over the engine of his old pickup truck, the smell of grease and patience as he showed me how to change the oil. It was the weight of a book he'd finish and leave on my nightstand, his notes penciled in the margins. We didn't need grand pronouncements. A single look across the dinner table was enough to share a private joke or a moment of solidarity. My relationship with my mother, by contrast, always felt curated. It was built for an audience, centered on social calendars and appearances. But with my dad, it was real. And it was in those quiet, authentic moments that I learned to read the man he truly was. This bond became my anchor in a house that was beginning to feel less like a home and more like an elaborate set for a play I didn't have the script for. The warmth I felt with my father made the growing chill in our house feel that much colder. Over the last year, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. My mother suddenly had a calendar full of new hobbies, late-night gallery openings and charity board meetings that stretched past midnight. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, became an extension of her hand, its screen always angled away, guarded. Her excuses for being late were mosaics of perfect, unbelievable detail. Through it all, my dad grew quieter. It wasn't the silence of anger, but of intense observation. He would sit in his armchair, a book open on his lap, but his focus wasn't on the page. He was listening, noting the sound of her car in the driveway, the precise time on the clock. Our house, once a home, began to feel like a stage. A meticulously designed set for a play where my mother was the star, and my dad and I were the only ones who hadn't been given the script. Oh, this vague, suffocating anxiety became a constant presence, a suspicion without proof. And then, one afternoon, the performance slipped, and that suspicion was about to get a name. I came home early one afternoon to find her in the kitchen, her back to me, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, a soft murmur I hadn't heard her use in years, a tone reserved for secrets. Then I heard it, just before she saw me, a quiet, "Talk soon, my love." She ended the call instantly, and when she turned, there was a flicker of panic in her eyes before the mask of composure slipped back into place. Oh, you startled me," she said, her smile a little too bright. "That was Mark. We were just finalizing some catering details for your father's party. He has a contact, you know?" The explanation was too quick, too polished, filled with unnecessary detail. Mark was my dad's best friend, but the tone wasn't friendly. It was intimate. That was the moment. It was the first concrete crack in the facade, where years of vague anxiety finally crystallized into a sickening certainty. The ground beneath me didn't just shift. It felt like it was dissolving. A feeling is one thing, but I knew in that moment I needed something I could hold in my hand. Driven by that single, chilling realization, I started noticing things. A few days later, I was searching for an envelope in my mother's home office when I saw it. A credit card statement, left carelessly on the corner of her desk. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wasn't snooping, but my eyes caught a charge that didn't belong. It was from an exclusive downtown jeweler. A 5-figure purchase for a diamond necklace I'd never seen. I knew with absolute certainty it wasn't for her. The betrayal was no longer just a feeling. It was a transaction with a receipt. The abstract suspicion I'd been carrying now had a price tag attached. Holding that piece of paper felt like holding a weapon. The silence in the house was no longer just quiet. It was filled with the weight of this ugly, documented truth, and I knew I couldn't carry it alone. I had to say something. I waited until she was alone in the living room, the credit card statement feeling heavy in my hand. I tried to keep my voice even, asking about the charge from the jeweler, framing it as simple confusion. The shift was immediate and violent. Her warmth evaporated, replaced by an icy indignation. "Are you going through my private papers now?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about the necklace. It was about my transgression. She accused me of being paranoid, of actively trying to find fault in her life. She painted me as a saboteur, someone trying to destroy her happiness out of jealousy. The attack was so swift, so complete, that I found myself stammering, defending my own actions. I left the room feeling disoriented and ashamed. The truth I had been holding so firmly now twisted into a weapon against me. It was a masterful performance of gaslighting, and it was its own kind of confession. For 2 days, the truth sat like a stone in my gut. My mother's cold, dismissive rage had slammed a door between us, and I knew I couldn't carry this knowledge alone. I found my father in his workshop, the air smelling of sawdust and oil, the scent of his quiet integrity. He was sanding a piece of wood, his movements steady and practiced. My own hands were trembling as I laid the credit card statement on his workbench. I explained everything in a low voice. The hushed phone call, the 5-figure charge, my mother's immediate attack. Each word felt like a betrayal. I braced myself for the explosion I was sure would follow, for the grief and rage of a man seeing his 35-year legacy crumble. I had just handed my father the grenade that would blow his life apart. The burden was no longer mine, but as I watched him stare at the piece of paper, I had no idea if the weight of it would simply break him. But he didn't shatter. He didn't even crack. He looked at the statement, and a profound sadness washed over his face. A grief for something already long dead. Then it was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute calm. He folded the paper neatly and met my eyes. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice perfectly level. "I needed to be sure." He then asked me to do the hardest thing imaginable, to say nothing, to go on as if this conversation never happened, to simply trust him. In that moment, the entire history of the past year clicked into place. He hadn't just discovered the betrayal, he was simply confirming its details. The quiet in our house was no longer about hiding a secret. It was about building a weapon. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in controlled deception. On the surface, our family life continued its placid, predictable rhythm. My father still asked my mother about her day over dinner, his expression one of polite interest. But I saw the second life he was living, the one that began after the house fell dark. I would see the light on under his study door, sometimes until 2 in the morning. I'd catch him on quiet phone calls, his back to me, his voice a low, clinical murmur, using words like fiduciary duty and chain of evidence. One afternoon, I saw him at the family safe. He wasn't rushed or angry. His movements were deliberate as he removed thick binders of financial statements and property deeds, placing them carefully into a new, unfamiliar briefcase. He was building an ark in total silence, preparing for a flood only we knew was coming. This was his quiet rebellion, a meticulous gathering of facts, a methodical construction of an unbreachable case. He was moving chess pieces on a board my mother didn't even know she was playing on. And I soon learned this wasn't just a reaction. It was a strategy, a hidden message he had received from the one person who could teach him how to win. My father finally brought me into the fold. In his study, he laid out the strategy his lawyer had given him, and it was a piece of cold, tactical brilliance. "It's not about what we know," he explained, his voice quiet.
It's about what she admits.
Publicly. The lawyer had explained that in our state, proven adultery could be an absolute bar to alimony. The hidden message was to let her walk right into it. Let her build the stage, send the invitations, and hand her the microphone.
My mother was so wrapped up in the drama of her grand romantic gesture that she was blind to the legal architecture being built around her.
She thought she was setting a bomb to detonate his future, the legacy of their 35 years together.
She didn't realize she was standing in the blast radius herself, holding the fuse.
The strategy was flawless, but it required one final piece of undeniable proof, and my father knew that confirmation was just one phone call away.
The call came on a Tuesday evening. My father answered it in his study, leaving the door slightly ajar. I heard the clipped professional voice on the other end. It was the private investigator. The man spoke in facts, not feelings, delivering a report of dates, hotel names, and reservation times, a complete, irrefutable timeline of their affair. I watched my father's reflection in the dark window as he listened. His expression didn't change, but it settled. The sadness was gone, replaced by something harder, more resolute. He was no longer a man absorbing a betrayal. He was a strategist confirming the enemy's position. After a long silence, he simply said, "The package is complete. Send the final invoice to my lawyer." He hung up the phone and turned to me, his eyes holding a terrifying clarity. "It's time," he said. The proof was secured. All he needed now was the perfect stage for the final act. And then, with an audacity that still takes my breath away, my mother announced her plan. She called a small family meeting and declared she was going to throw my father a huge surprise 60th birthday party. The irony was staggering. She was so blinded by her own arrogance, she was meticulously building the very stage her own life would be dismantled on. To my shock, my father agreed with a warm, genuine smile. He thanked her for being so thoughtful. Later that evening, he called me into his study. He didn't say a word. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, professionally bound document. On the cover, in stark black letters, were the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." It was all there. Financial affidavits, the investigator's report, a proposed settlement citing the adultery clause. "We'll let her have her party," he said, his voice calm and level. "We'll let her fill a room with everyone she wants to impress." He placed the documents back in the briefcase with the finality of a judge closing a case. The plan was no longer a theory. It was a physical object, waiting. We thought we understood the full scope of her betrayal, but her own confidence would soon reveal a layer of cruelty we hadn't even imagined. A few nights before the party, I heard my mother's voice drifting from her bedroom. It was light and conspiratorial, a tone I hadn't heard in years. She was on the phone with Mark. "It's gonna be perfect," she was saying, giddy with anticipation. All of his friends, our entire social circle, there to witness the truth. They have to see that this isn't some sordid little affair. This is us choosing happiness. With courage. There was a pause, and then she laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Oh, don't you worry about him. He'll be stunned, of course. Utterly floored. But what's he gonna do? Yell? He's not a fighter. He'll just crumble. It's kinder this way, really. A clean public break so no one can whisper." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Besides, I've already moved things around. I've made sure we're more than taken care of. He won't even know what hit him until it's all over." I backed away from the door, a cold, sickening disgust rising in my throat. This wasn't a woman torn by a difficult choice. This was a predator, admiring the flawless design of her own trap. She saw my father's quiet nature not as a source of strength, but as a fundamental weakness to be exploited. She wasn't just leaving him, she was planning his public demolition, and she was going to call it courage. She believed his silence was emptiness, not the calm before a storm. Listening to her, I realized any lingering shred of sympathy I had was gone. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was a war she had declared without ever realizing her opponent was already on the battlefield, waiting. That night, my father walked me through the final steps. It was no longer just a legal proceeding, it was a battle plan. My role is simple, he told me, his voice low and steady in the quiet of his study. I will be the perfect guest of honor. I'll smile, I'll accept their good wishes, and when she stands up to speak, I will let her have the floor. He explained the cold logic. Her public confession was the final critical piece of evidence. We wouldn't interrupt. We wouldn't react. We would simply allow her to construct her own legacy of deceit, word by word, in front of everyone she was trying to impress. His composure was absolute. The night before, I watched as he laid out the dark gray suit he would wear. He took the crisp manila envelope, the one containing the culmination of months of quiet, painstaking work, and slid it into the inside breast pocket. It was his hidden weapon, resting right over his heart. She's planned a surprise, he said, smoothing the lapel of the jacket. But the real surprise is that this party was never for me. It's for her. With the plan set and the weapon in place, all that remained was for the curtain to rise on the most elaborate, tragic performance of my mother's life. The day of the party arrived, a perfect, sunny afternoon for a public execution disguised as a celebration. Our home was filled with forced joy, the sound of laughter from oblivious guests echoing off the walls. My mother was in her element, radiant and commanding, playing the role of the perfect wife throwing the perfect party. My father was her quiet shadow, a portrait of calm dignity, his smile a mask of polite gratitude. I moved through the crowd feeling like an actor in a tragedy, the only other person in the room who knew this beautiful set was about to be torn down. Every handshake, every hollow toast felt like a countdown to an explosion. Every piece was on the board, precisely where my father wanted it. We were moments away from the point of no return. It makes you wonder, what is the right way to handle a public betrayal? Do you meet fire with fire, or do you let the other person burn themselves out on their own arrogance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you're invested in seeing how this plays out, make sure you subscribe because you won't want to miss what happens next. My mother picked up the microphone, a practiced, mournful smile on her face. And her performance began, not with an attack, but with a tribute, a saccharine, carefully constructed eulogy for the man she was about to destroy. I want to thank you all for being here, she began, her voice catching with a perfectly rehearsed tremor. To celebrate this incredible man. She turned to my father, her eyes shining with manufactured adoration. The toast started as a list of his virtues. She praised his loyalty, his quiet strength, his unwavering stability. Every word was a poisoned dart disguised as a compliment. She was building him up into a monument, a solid, dependable statue, precisely so she could justify her need to break free from something so predictable. This wasn't a tribute, it was a preemptive strike. She was manipulating the entire room, painting a portrait of a good, if perhaps unexciting, man who had given her a safe life. When she finally announced she was leaving, it wouldn't be seen as a betrayal. It would be framed as an act of courage, the sad but necessary choice of a woman finally choosing to live. She was laying the groundwork for her own sainthood, and the crowd was drinking it in. As her syrupy words washed over them, my eyes drifted across the room, past the nodding heads and sympathetic smiles, and landed on the one other person in on the performance. He wasn't just watching. He was basking in the glow of a victory he believed was only moments away. As my mother continued her performance, my gaze swept across the room. I saw my father's oldest friends, our aunts and uncles, all smiling warmly, completely unaware they were extras in a tragedy, applauding the villain. They heard a tribute. I heard an indictment. He was standing near the front, his expression a sickening mix of adoration for my mother and a smug confidence that radiated from him in waves. In his mind, the game was already over.
He saw himself as the romantic hero, just minutes away from claiming his prize, my mother, and with her, the comfortable life my father had built. He glanced at my dad, and for a second, I saw a flicker of pity in his eyes. It was the same look he'd given him earlier that night, a gesture of false friendship that was the most profound betrayal of all. That look of pity had come with a gift. Earlier in the evening, Mark had pulled my father into a hug that lasted just a moment too long, a performance of brotherly affection for the crowd. He'd pressed a small, heavy box into my dad's hand, a ridiculously expensive watch that was less a gift and more a down payment on his guilt. I saw the whole exchange, but it was the look on Mark's face that I'll never forget. It was the look of a man consoling another for a loss he himself had engineered. A blend of compassion and complete victory. This wasn't just a betrayal between two old friends. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a birthday party. Every guest, every toast, every smiling photo was a piece of ammunition my mother and Mark were using to legitimize their coup. They believed they were writing the first chapter of a brave new story. They didn't understand. They were just footnotes in a history my father had already finished writing. And as my mother's speech wound down, my father gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was time for him to say a few words, to deliver his own quiet toast, a final, wistful goodbye to the 35 years she was so eager to burn. Just as my mother paused for dramatic effect, ready to launch into her grand finale, my father gently raised his hand. "If you don't mind," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I'd just like to say a few words." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but she couldn't refuse. She handed him the microphone with a tight smile. He stood, not with the energy of a man at his own party, but with the solemn grace of someone giving a eulogy. He thanked his friends, his family, for being part of his life's story. 60 years, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, but seeing something far beyond them. It's a long time. Long enough to understand that all stories are made of chapters. And you eventually learn that for a new one to begin, an old one must, with dignity, come to a close. A few people nodded, interpreting it as a simple reflection on aging. But I heard the sound of a door being quietly, irrevocably locked. He wasn't just talking about a birthday. He was closing the book on their marriage. "What I've come to value most," he continued, his voice perfectly even, "is the importance of truth. Not the loud, convenient truths we tell ourselves to get by, but the quiet, difficult ones that in the end are the only things that truly matter." It was his final warning, a goodbye disguised as a toast. He raised his glass. "To the truth." The room applauded politely. My mother, beaming, thought he had just set the perfect somber stage for her brave announcement. She had no idea he had just delivered the epilogue to her entire world. She took the microphone back, her face a mask of sorrowful determination. The room was perfectly silent, hanging on her next words. She had them precisely where she wanted them, wrapped in a narrative of her own careful design.
"My husband," she began, her voice cracking just so, "is a good man.
He gave me a life of stability. But sometimes stability isn't enough. Sometimes a person has a right to be happy, to feel alive." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind you practice in a mirror. "And that is why," she said, her eyes finding my father across the room. "With the heaviest heart, I have to finally be honest." The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air.
"I'm leaving him!" A collective, sharp intake of breath sucked the oxygen from the room.
Before anyone could process it, she delivered the final fatal blow.
"Mark and we're in love!"
Dead silence. Just 100 pairs of eyes darting between my mother's triumphant, tear-streaked face and my father's quiet form. She held his gaze, her expression a mix of pity and expectation, waiting for the collapse, for the public validation of her difficult choice. This was her moment, the one she had rehearsed. She then turned her gaze to the side of the room, a silent invitation for her co-conspirator to step out of the shadows and claim his victory beside her. And right on cue, Mark began to move. He stepped out from the cluster of stunned guests like an actor hitting his mark, his face a mask of solemn, heroic resolve. He believed he was the romantic lead in this story, the man brave enough to claim the love he deserved, whatever the cost. Every step through the parted crowd was deliberate, a slow-motion walk toward his new life. He was a conqueror, claiming his spoils. When he reached my mother and took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a gesture of reassurance, he didn't just look at her. His eyes scanned the room. He saw the expensive art on the walls, the influential guests, the entire architecture of a life built by another man. This was his inheritance now, a kingdom he believed he had seized without a single battle. He saw a future funded by my father's legacy, a life of comfort and prestige won through this one audacious public act. He and my mother stood there, a perfectly synchronized portrait of self-congratulatory delusion, their hands clasped in a show of unbreakable unity. They had delivered their lines flawlessly. They had executed their plan. Now, they turned as one, their triumphant, pitying gazes falling upon my father. The entire room, a sea of shocked faces, turned with them, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The murmur of the party didn't just fade, it was extinguished, as if a switch had been flipped on the entire world. A half-spoken word, the clink of a fork, it all vanished into a vacuum of stunning silence. The air grew thick, charged with the secondhand shame and horror of 100 guests. Every gaze in the room, like iron filings to a magnet, snapped to a single point. My father. He was no longer the guest of honor. He was the spectacle, the man who had just been publicly vivisected by his wife and his best friend. The crowd was a frozen tableau of shock, their faces locked in a shared, horrified anticipation. They were waiting for the inevitable performance of a broken man. They expected the disbelief, the flash of rage, the crumbling of a lifetime of dignity into a messy public spectacle of grief.
This was the script society had written for this exact moment.
My mother and Mark stood together, watching him with a terrible, patient stillness.
His pain was the final ingredient they needed to legitimize their betrayal, to transform their sordid affair into a tragic, necessary love story.
His collapse would be their absolution. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last, the silence in the room becoming a deafening roar of expectation. The pressure was immense, a demand for a reaction he was supposed to give. They were waiting for the victim to finally break. They had no idea they were about to witness a verdict. But my father didn't break. He didn't even flinch. He simply smiled. It wasn't a pained smile or a mask of dignity fighting back tears. It was a genuine, quiet smile of profound and chilling clarity. The smile of a man who held all the cards. He looked at my mother, then at Mark, holding their triumphant gaze for a long, silent moment. He slowly raised his champagne flute, not in a grand toast, but in a simple, almost casual acknowledgement. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the shattered whisper everyone expected. It was calm, measured, and carried to every corner of the silent room. "Well," he said, the word cutting through the tension like a razor. "Thank you for your honesty." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. It was a complete narrative derailment. My mother's carefully constructed tragedy, with her as the brave protagonist, suddenly had no victim. The crowd just stared. 100 confused faces, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they were supposed to feel. This wasn't grief. It wasn't rage. It was absolute control. My mother's triumphant expression faltered, her jaw slackening with disbelief. The power she thought she held had just evaporated. He had refused to play his part, and in doing so, he took the entire stage from her. His smile remained as he calmly set his glass down, the small clink echoing in the silence. He was done watching. Now, he was going to act. He took one step, then another, moving toward her with a calm deliberation that was more terrifying than any shout could ever be. The crowd parted for him, a silent, unwilling audience to this private execution. My mother's face was a canvas of confusion, her victorious smile frozen in place. Mark's hand, still holding hers, seemed to tighten. My father stopped directly in front of them. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out the crisp manila envelope. He held it out to her. Her hand trembled as she took it, her eyes darting from his face to the plain brown paper. "I've known for 6 months," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the entire room. "These are for you." Her triumphant expression finally cracked, dissolving into pure bewilderment. She fumbled with the clasp, pulling out the thick sheaf of papers.
Her eyes scanned the first page, and I saw the exact moment the words registered. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The color drained from her face. Her perfect, romantic narrative had just collided with the cold, hard language of the law.
The power wasn't just gone. It had never been hers at all.
He had simply let her believe it was, waiting for her to say everything he needed to hear. And now that she had, the real conversation was about to begin. He finally turned his gaze to Mark, including him in the verdict. "My lawyer," he said, his voice still low, "has photos,
Bank statements.
a detailed timeline of every hotel, every gift, every dollar you moved." He let the words settle in the suffocating silence, each one a nail in the coffin of their grand romance.
He was no longer speaking to his wife or his friend. He was addressing two co-conspirators.
"So this is the choice you have," he continued, looking back at my mother. "You will sign these papers exactly as they are written, with the adultery clause intact. You'll walk away with what the law allows for, and nothing more. Or we can go to court, and I promise you, this little party will feel like a quiet afternoon compared to what becomes public record."
It wasn't a negotiation.
It was a sentence. My mother stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but making no sound.
Mark, the conquering hero, looked like he'd been hollowed out.
My father had given them no room to bargain, no angle to exploit. He held all the power, and he had wielded it, not with rage, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a surgeon. He had redrawn the boundaries of their world, and they were left standing alone in the ruins. The party didn't so much end as it collapsed. Guests averted their eyes, offering mumbled excuses as they fled into the night, escaping the thick, uncomfortable silence. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty, leaving my mother and Mark standing alone amidst the wreckage of their own celebration. The triumphant, united front they had presented just moments before had crumbled. They were just two people, isolated in a spotlight of their own making, surrounded by deflating balloons and the ruins of a half-eaten cake. Their grand romantic gesture had turned into a humiliating public defeat. The shock was still a veil over my mother's face, but I watched her hands tremble as she looked down at the papers she was holding. I knew the silence was only temporary, the calm before a different kind of storm. The silence in the room was a vacuum, and my mother's rage rushed in to fill it. As her eyes flew across the pages, the shock on her face curdled into a mask of pure, sputtering fury. The legal language was a cage she hadn't known was being built around her, and she rattled its bars with a sudden, ugly scream. It wasn't a sound of grief. It was the shriek of a predator caught in a trap. She accused my father of being a monster, a cold, calculating snake who had planned her humiliation. She threw the pages onto the floor, the legal architecture of her defeat scattering around her feet. "You were never man enough to fight for me," she shrieked. "So you plotted in the dark. This is weakness. This is a coward's revenge." Through it all, Mark was a statue of dawning horror. The romantic hero had vanished, replaced by a pale, silent man whose eyes were fixed on the scattered papers. I could see the cold arithmetic happening behind his gaze as he calculated the future he had just lost. The grand legacy he thought he was inheriting was nothing but a pile of legal obligations and public shame. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. He just stared at his own ruin. My father waited for her tirade to run out of breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even seem angry. He just looked at them both, two strangers standing in the ruins of his party, and said two simple words: "Get out." There was one last, impotent outburst from my mother, a final threat that hung in the air with no weight. Then they were gone, leaving a profound, echoing silence in their wake. The house was finally quiet again, but I knew it was only a temporary truce. She had failed to break my father, so I knew exactly who her next target would be. The phone rang the next morning. I knew who it was before I answered. "You helped him," she spat. No greeting, just raw accusation. "You stood there and watched him humiliate me." "You were part of it." Her voice was a ragged mix of fury and self-pity. I kept my own voice level, a mirror of the calm my father had shown. "I told him the truth, Mom. That's all. The rest was his decision." Her tactics shifted instantly from rage to desperate pleading. "But I'm your mother. How could you let him do this to me? He's a cruel, vindictive man. He plotted this." "No," I said, and the word was colder than I intended. "He just refused to play his part. He wanted a dramatic scene. You needed him to fall apart, to make your story feel brave. You didn't want a husband anymore. You wanted an audience for your third act." The line went silent for a moment, the truth landing with the weight of a stone. "I'm not going to be in the middle of this," I said, making a promise to myself as much as to her. "This is between you and him." I ended the call. By refusing to be her confidant, I had closed one door. But she was never going to let the story end there. She just needed a new audience, and she was about to find one by turning our entire social circle into her personal courtroom. The story of the party became a currency of its own, traded in whispers over phone lines and text messages. Friends of my parents began taking sides, and my phone became a switchboard for their opinions. An aunt called, her voice thick with disapproval, to tell me my father's actions were cruel and unnecessarily public. "A man should have the dignity to suffer in private," she insisted. It was a strange and revealing realization. People were more offended by his refusal to be a victim than by my mother's betrayal. They wanted him to suffer quietly, to absorb the blow so their world wouldn't be disturbed. Most calls were easy to dismiss, but one was different. It was from the chairman of a foundation where my mother had been treasurer for years.
He was professional, his concern carefully veiled, but his questions were all about reputation and liability. I kept my answers short and factual, echoing my father's calm. "My mother made her choices public," I said. My father simply responded with the truth. As I hung up, his professional concern about money echoed in my mind. It was the first time I understood that the consequences of my mother's actions extended far beyond our family. And it made me remember her words to Mark on the phone, the ones I had overheard. She wasn't just planning an exit, she was planning a heist. My father's lawyer called a few days later. The social fallout was one thing, but the financial one was a different beast entirely. They had uncovered the truth behind her words on the phone, that she had moved things around. It wasn't just a few $1,000s siphoned from a joint account. It was a systematic plundering. For over 18 months, she had been forging my father's signature on documents to liquidate shared investments, moving the cash into a secret offshore account. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was grand larceny. This wasn't just a plan for a new life. It was a scorched earth policy designed to leave him with nothing. The affair was a betrayal of the heart. But this was a crime. It was cold, methodical, and it stripped away any last vestige of the woman I thought she was. Faced with irrefutable proof of a felony, the fight she thought she had didn't just collapse. It surrendered unconditionally. The meeting with her lawyer was brutally short. There were no loopholes, no clever arguments left to make. Her counsel's advice was simple and absolute. Sign the papers. The alternative wasn't just losing in court. It was the possibility of criminal charges. Her entire war, waged with such public arrogance, was lost with a single, quiet checkmate. A few days later, she sat across from my father in a sterile conference room. The vibrant, triumphant woman from the party was gone, replaced by someone smaller, her confidence stripped away, leaving only a brittle exhaustion. There were no more threats, no more desperate accusations. She just stared at the final page of the divorce decree, the one awaiting her signature. She didn't read the words. She already knew the terms of her surrender. She picked up the heavy pen. With one quiet, deliberate scratch, she signed her name, formally ending a 35-year legacy. The signature was shaky, a dark scar on the page. She slid the document across the polished table toward my father, but her eyes never met his. They looked past him, toward the door, as if she was suddenly realizing that the man she had sacrificed everything for was now just a co-conspirator in a failed coup, and the barren ground they stood on was all they had left. It was only a few weeks later that I learned, through the inevitable grapevine of shattered friendships, that their great love story was already over. The foundation of their alliance wasn't passion. It was a business plan, and my father had just triggered a brutal, unforgiving audit. The grand romance, announced so bravely to a room full of witnesses, apparently couldn't survive its first encounter with a utility bill. Mark, who had betrayed a 40-year friendship for a guaranteed future of comfort, was now facing a reality he never signed up for. He was tied to a woman who was no longer the key to a kingdom, but a co-owner of its considerable ruins and liabilities. The story I heard was that he accused her of misleading him, of failing to properly assess the target. He never would have risked everything, he said, if he'd known my father had a spine. He blamed her for the miscalculation. She, in turn, called him a coward and a parasite, a man who was only ever in love with her potential inheritance. Their bond wasn't broken by an outside force. It simply starved to death once it was cut off from its host. The collapse of their private world was just the first, most personal domino to fall. The consequences didn't arrive like a tidal wave. They were more like a slow, rising tide that quietly reclaimed everything. My mother, stripped of the assets she had tried to steal, had to sell the luxury car that had been her primary status symbol. She moved into a small, nondescript apartment on the other side of town, a world away from the grand home where she had commanded her social life. The friends she had counted on to be her chorus of support at the party saw her not as a brave romantic, but as a desperate gambler who had lost everything on a bad bet. One by one, they quietly distanced themselves. The phone calls stopped. The lunch invitations dried up. Their silence was a more damning verdict than any public condemnation could ever be. Mark fared no better. He became a social ghost in a town that prided itself on loyalty. The men he had known for decades, my father's friends, would see him at the golf club and simply turn their backs, a gesture of silent, complete contempt. Business partners suddenly found reasons to end contracts. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered at dinner parties, a synonym for a man who would betray a lifetime of friendship for a prize that turned to dust in his hands. He was a pariah, completely isolated in the wreckage of a life he'd tried to steal. There was no single dramatic moment of defeat for them, just the quiet, steady erosion of a world built on a lie. It was a legacy of their own making, a slow-motion collapse under the weight of their own choices. My mother's world became smaller and smaller, defined by the constant, nagging presence of everything she had lost. But in the space created by their departure, my father's world began to expand. His focus wasn't on what was taken from him, but on what he could now freely give. And his first act in this new life wasn't about vengeance or retribution. It was a final, quiet gift that redefined their entire history together in a way she never could have anticipated. The oppressive weight that had settled in our house for years simply lifted. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was light, filled with the sound of him whistling in his workshop, or the classical music he loved playing softly in the evenings. For the first time in a decade, I saw him truly smile, a relaxed, easy expression that reached his eyes. He started taking long road trips in his old pickup truck, just to see the country. He reconnected with friends my mother had long ago dismissed. He wasn't just free from a bad marriage, he was free to be himself again. This peace was his final, most profound victory. It was a fragile, new world, and I knew my mother would eventually try to breach its walls, forcing me to finally build my own. About 6 months later, my mother called. The rage was gone,
replaced by a quiet, carefully constructed victimhood. She spoke of loneliness, of how Mark was gone, and how she just wanted to see her daughter. I agreed to meet her at a small coffee shop downtown, a place with no history for us, a piece of neutral ground. She looked smaller. The sharp, ambitious energy that had always defined her, now replaced by a brittle exhaustion. She wanted things to go back to how they were, for me to be her confidant, her ally against a world that had, in her telling, unfairly punished her. I let her speak, and when she was finished, I looked at her, not with anger, but with a clarity I had learned from my father. "I will always be your daughter," I said, my voice steady. "But I can't be your friend. The roles we used to play are gone." I explained that if we were to have a relationship at all, it would have to be built on something new, something honest. No more performances. No more using me as a pawn in her dramas. We could have dinner once a month. We could talk on the phone. But the old intimacy, the one that required me to be her silent audience, was over. I was drawing a line, not to punish her, but to protect myself. For the first time in my life, she didn't argue. She just nodded. A quiet acknowledgement of a truth she could no longer fight. I walked away from that coffee shop feeling a strange sense of peace. It was my own quiet rebellion, a final lesson learned from my father about the strength found in setting boundaries. It was a necessary conversation, but it left me thinking about the other family ties that had been frayed by years of my mother's influence. There was another relationship, one I had let wither in the shadow of all this drama, that I now knew I had to rebuild. I found my father in his workshop a few weeks later, the late afternoon sun cutting through the dusty air, illuminating millions of dancing particles. He wasn't working on anything grand. He was meticulously restoring an old wooden chair, the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper the only sound. I sat on a stool and watched him for a long time, the familiar scent of sawdust and oil feeling like a homecoming. The silence that settled between us was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was simply peace. A shared space where words weren't necessary. He set the sandpaper down and ran a weathered hand over the smooth, naked wood. "I'm thinking of finally taking that road trip out west," he said, his gaze fixed on the open garage door, on the stretch of road that disappeared into the horizon. The one we always talked about. "I think you should," I said, my voice quiet. "I'll even help you pack." He finally turned to me, and the smile that had once been a piece of chilling strategy at the party was now just a smile. It was open and unburdened, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes with a light I had forgotten was there. In that moment, I understood the true nature of his victory. It was never about revenge. It was about reclamation of his peace, his future, his own story. My mother's grand performance was designed to be the loudest explosion, the defining moment of all our lives, a legacy written in fire. But the loudest explosions are not always the ones that cause the most change. Sometimes the most profound shifts, the ones that redraw the entire map of your world, happen in the steady, patient silence that follows. After seeing the father's victory was quiet reclamation, not loud revenge, what does winning after a deep betrayal really mean?
Tell me in the comments below. I read and reply to every single one. This pattern of betrayal isn't just in families. In the next video, best friends ghost someone only to find out she's their new boss. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the truth. Like and share this with someone who needs to see this strength.